Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming out on this balmy evening here in tropical New Hampshire. It's great to see this turnout. This is the first time in years that this series has happened at this time of day, and we wondered, would anyone come? But you came, so thank you. My name is Bert Feintuck. I direct the Center for the Humanities on campus, and I'm happy to welcome you to the keynote in the 2017-2018 Saul O Sidore Memorial Lectures. We want to thank the Sidore Family Foundation for supporting this series, which they have done for decades. Saul Sidore was an industrialist in Manchester who died in 1964. And sometime not long after that, the family decided that they wanted to create a lecture series at UNH to memorialize him. So this is a product of a gift that has been coming annually to the university for more than 40 years, I think maybe even more than 50 years, which is quite a remarkable thing, I think, and a great example of philanthropy. So we really do appreciate the Sidore family support. And now, in my role as the person who introduces the person who introduces the person, here's Professor Sarah Wolper, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
I'd like to begin with two announcements before getting into introducing tonight's speaker. The first announcement is if you have cell phones, please silence them or put them away. And the second announcement is none of this would have been at all possible, not just without Saul O Sidore and the series, but with Jen McCready, who has done an amazing job, and sadly for her will continue to do an amazing job in helping with the series. So I wanted to give her a special thanks before I began. It's a great pleasure tonight for me to introduce Dr. Erin Thompson. She's somebody whose work I've been following for years, and when we first started to think about the Sidore series and questions about collecting and heritage and art, she was a name that immediately came up, and it was clear to us that she was really a person whose work really embodied many of the questions we were asking about who owns the past and what that meant and how to enforce questions like that. And we see her work as really at the center of issues on stewardship, and cultural heritage. She is, by self-definition, the only full-time art lawyer in the United States, which is an amazing thing to be. She, in her career, has combined a love of antiquities and art with legal and philosophical analogies of ownership and what ownership means. She's currently the Associate Professor of Fraud, Forensics, Art, Law, and Crime at the Department of Art and Music at John Jay College in the City University of New York. She began her career at Barnard, studying art history and philosophy, and went on to get her MA, her MPhil, and her PhD in art history of the ancient world and the Near Eastern world. Simultaneously, and with some of this, she also went on to get a certification in global business at the Institut des Études at the Sorbonne and a JD at Columbia Law School. She has a series of prestigious fellowships in the public humanities, the most recent of which was at Rice University on forgery and the ancient art, agency, and authorship. She has a wide range of publications and media appearances, including in the New York Times, on CNN, on NPR. And in all of these, she has shared her great expertise on cultural health, on cultural heritage, property and law, and her deep knowledge of ancient art and society. Her book came out in 2016 from Yale University Press, which was entitled Possession: The Curious History of Private Collection. And it was described by one of the reviewers as a savvy history of passion and politics. She has done significant public outreach work. Her most recent is she's one of the co-curators of the Ode to the Sea, Art from Guantanamo Bay, which will be taking place between September 20th and November 17th at the President's Gallery at John Jay College in New York. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Erin Thompson speaking on Who Owns Palmyra.
Thank you very much for having me. And the topic of this lecture series, Who Owns the Past, I will say, is one in which there are, in general, many more questions than there are answers, and an infinitely greater amount of opinions than there is consensus. But it's the prerogative of a first speaker in a lecture series to raise more questions than she answers, and I intend to take in full this prerogative tonight. And to me, the urgency of the questions and the need for answers is really what makes this field of cultural heritage so exciting, and I hope some of you students in the audience will be inspired to work more on it as well. In particular, I want to use tonight as an opportunity to think not just about the question posed by my title of Who Owns Palmyra, but also to think about what ownership of cultural heritage and cultural property in general means, and especially who gets to exercise the privileges of ownership and who has to bear the responsibilities of ownership. I will ask these questions by focusing on one case study, the city of Palmyra in what is now Syria, and the grand decorated buildings and tombs built there in antiquity when the Palmyrans profited from being one of the main stops on the trade routes that brought silk, jade, spices, and other luxuries from China and India to Rome. I never saw clusters of grapes so bold, so lively, so natural in any place, wrote William Halifax, one of the first English speakers to see Palmyra, in particular to see these grapes on the decorating the Temple of Bel. He traveled to Palmyra in 1691 with a group of English merchants who had established a trading colony in the city of Aleppo, but were bored there, shut off from the city's inhabitants by mutual suspicion. They listened to stories of fantastical ruins in the desert only a few days' journey away, and traveled there with many guards, visiting the site cautiously and hurriedly, frightened of quote-unquote mountain Arabs who might descend upon them. Even as late as 1912, English guidebooks warned travelers to take an armed escort to Palmyra, someone to protect you from the living while you communed with the dead. Palmyra's temples of Bel and Baal Shamin, built respectively in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, were among the best preserved buildings of antiquity. They were made of local limestone of a dusty, pinky, orangey tone, as if perpetually shining in the light of sunset. Their walls and ceiling were carved with images, those clusters of grapes, a zodiac, a caravan of camels, greeted by women swathed in so many layers of veils that they looked like surrealist dream portraits. Also, images of gods and goddesses. Bel was a stern, bearded father. Baal Shamin took many forms. Frequently, he was an eagle, outspread wings sheltering the moon and sun. Bel and Baal Shamin were two names for the same god, the Father, Lord of the Sky, King of the Universe, the boss. Bel was what they called this god inland, deeper from Palmyra, in the territory that is now Iraq. Baal Shamin was his name in Phoenicia, along the coast in what is now Lebanon. Palmyra's trade routes linked to these populations, and its citizens and visitors worshiped their similar gods without, it seems, overmuch worry about who is best. In May 2015, the radical jihadist group calling itself the Islamic State, IS, gained control of Tadmir, Syria, its strategic gas fields, and the neighboring archaeological site of Palmyra. In June, IS fighters packed rusty oil containers with explosives and strung them together with fuses like malevolent ornaments through the ruins. They waited nearly 2 months before lighting these fuses and exploding the temples, first Baal Shamin, and then, when the world's attention was caught a few days later, the larger and more spectacular Temple of Bel. These temples were destroyed to communicate a message. IS used the publicity it gained from destroying these and other antiquities to reach foreign-born recruits who have proved especially susceptible to messages of iconoclasm. By destroying the temples, IS was insisting that they were powerful and that the West was powerless to, in this case, do something as seemingly simple as protect a few pieces of stone. IS's strategy, the deliberate destruction of cultural property, is of course nothing new. Humans have been destroying cultural property almost as long as they have been making it, and mostly for the same reasons, from urban development to religious fervor to symbolic displays of power over an enemy or captive population. We have only to look at World War II, when thousands of monuments and artifacts across Europe were damaged and destroyed, sometimes accidentally as collateral damage during war, and sometimes deliberately as part of the Nazi program of cultural genocide, designed to wipe out the heritage of peoples targeted for extinction. The Nazis also systematically looted the public and private art collections of conquered territories, as IS has been doing as well. It is estimated that between 1/4 and 1/3 of all artworks in Europe were moved during World War II. The destruction of art during this period, during World War II, shaped our current understanding of the law and ethics of cultural property. A second important strand of thought coalesced shortly after the war. In the 1960s, many states with rich archaeological heritages, so-called source countries, experienced large upswells in looting and smuggling activity. Archaeological sites were being destroyed by looters seeking ancient artifacts to smuggle out of the country to be sold to collectors in the United States, Western Europe, and other so-called markets countries, states with rich collectors and active antiquities markets, but relatively few sources of antiquities of their own. Great damage was and is done by the looters of archaeological sites. Looted tombs at Palmyra have had their architecture smashed, ceramic grave goods broken, textiles covering bodies ripped apart, and these human remains left to decay, all in order to obtain a few fragments of sculpture or a few pieces of jewelry for the market. Precious knowledge about the past, including what we could learn from ancient DNA before it is corrupted by the touch of looters, has been lost. In 1970, reacting to this destruction, source countries and market countries came together to cooperate through the United Nations to promulgate the UNESCO Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Export, Import, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. This is the key international treaty on the protection and repatriation of cultural property with 131 signatories. The 1970 convention has a sweeping goal of international cooperation to stop looting and smuggling of cultural heritage, requiring the governments of member states to take action at the request of any other member state whose cultural property has been stolen. But the language of the convention was a compromise between source countries, who wished for tight controls of antiquities, and market countries, who, even though they recognized the damage done by looting, still wanted to leave room for the legal sales of antiquities. Thus, the convention does not specify exactly what actions member states must take in order to fulfill their obligations to reduce looting, and generally leaves it up to member states to translate these goals into law. Accordingly, there's a broad range of national legislation ranging from strict bans on exporting or even owning antiquities in some countries to more permissive trading regimes in many countries with active antiquities markets. Under the current legal framework, and in most source countries, the question of who owns antiquities, however, is clear. It is the state. We might assume that the state is responsible for protecting these antiquities, but in fact, both history and the wording of the laws themselves show that, contrarily, destruction of antiquities is one of the privileges and powers of the states. The set of treaties known as the Hague Conventions regulate the behavior of states in times of war and military occupation. The 1954 Hague Convention requires refraining from any act of hostility directed against cultural property unless military necessity imperatively requires a waiver. Military necessity has, of course, proven an expansive concept, allowing, for example, the United States to pulverize the monastery of Monte Cassino, Italy during World War II, packed with art and civilians, despite it later being shown that the German troops they sought to displace were dug into the hillside surrounding the monastery, not in the complex itself. Or has allowed coalition forces to build a military base over the fragile archaeological site of the ancient city of Babylon, Iraq. Or, as is happening currently, is allowing Saudi Arabia to bomb into rubble architecture from the time of the Queen of Sheba in Yemen. A number of international instruments also speak to states' responsibilities to protect cultural heritage in times of peace. The 1973 UNESCO World Heritage Convention contains language about states' obligation to protect World Heritage sites located in their territories, as well as heritage in general, and the 2003 UNESCO Declaration concerning the intentional destruction of cultural heritage required states to take all appropriate measures to prevent acts of destruction of cultural property wherever located, and a state that intentionally destroys cultural property bears the responsibility for such destruction. However, this lofty language has not deterred states from undertaking, for example, development projects which have resulted in the destruction of cultural property, including the construction of the Aswan Dam in Egypt or the Three Gorges Dam in China, both of which flooded archaeologically rich areas. Nor has this language forced states to devote the huge amount of funds that would be necessary to fully protect their cultural heritage from looting. Large, isolated archaeological sites are especially vulnerable and expensive to protect. And for example, the looting of Native American sites located in public lands in the American Southwest is ongoing with hardly any meaningful prevention. In short, our current laws, both national and international, have major shortcomings when it comes to the protection of cultural property. How then should we settle these questions of what protection we owe to the past? How should we decide things like whether or not to repatriate an artifact, or what levels of export and import controls are justified, or whether destruction can ever be allowed? Stanford law professor John Henry Merriman's 1989 article, The Public Interest in Cultural Property, is one of the first to present a systematic means of answering these questions. Merriman's proposal has proven very influential. It has been cited many hundreds of times and is often the first article read by new students of cultural heritage law and policy. He argues that a triad of core values should inform any cultural heritage decisions. The core values Merriman identifies are preservation, truth, and access. For Merriman, the essential ingredient of any cultural property policy is that the object itself must be physically preserved. Secondly, the truth value of cultural artifacts must not be diminished, for example, by allowing the unchecked proliferation of forgeries. Finally, he believes we must allow the relevant public to access cultural heritage, by which he means that the widest possible public should be able to see these objects on display in museums. Looking at Merriman's values through the perspective of Palmyra, I argue, shows that they are not, in fact, universal values. They prioritize a Western experience of art over the needs and rights of source countries. And I believe these values are not even universal in the West. Instead, they are the values only of a small subset of Westerners, namely curators, scholars, and other art professionals. For Merriman, the centrality of the value of preservation is too obvious to need elaboration. For him, this value is tautological. If we don't care about its preservation, it isn't for us a cultural object. Merriman regards the destruction of cultural property as unquestionably negative. He calls those who have destroyed it, like Byzantine iconoclasts or French revolutionaries who burned aristocratic paintings, the villains of cultural history. Merriman prioritizes preservation even though he knows that not everyone agrees with preservation as a necessary goal. He devotes a paragraph to the clear culture conflict that results when a source culture creates an object with the intention that it be destroyed, consumed, deteriorate through exposure, or be seen only by a restricted group of people. He writes that such intentions are common and that for the creating cultures, the proper treatment of the object may be essential to life, and the violation may be a spiritual disaster that threatens drastic consequences for the group. Yet he mentioned these beliefs only to dismiss them, writing that despite the reasons why their creators might want them to be consumed or destroyed or hidden, these objects should be preserved because all of the reasons why we want to preserve and display these objects are still present. Merriman's true prioritization of values is clear from his language. All the reasons why we want to preserve, who is this we whose desires take priority over those of the creators of the contested objects? The we for Merriman are the groups he lists in the introduction to his article: archaeologists and anthropologists, historians, museum professionals, dealers and collectors, and politicians. His list does not include creators of cultural property, and thus he is able to dismiss the desires of any creators or users who do not think that preservation is the highest goal or even a desirable one. Merriman's failure is not just the failure to give proper weight to non-Western points of view about the value of preservation. Merriman also failed to understand crucial Western attitudes towards preservation and destruction. The failure is perhaps a result of a key omission because Merriman's list of Westerners whose attitudes and agenda matter for decisions about cultural property does not include a very important group, the wider public whose access to cultural property he is so anxious to preserve. Merriman has forgotten that preservation's value is obvious to the point of tautology only to a small slice of the population, and then only with regard to certain sets of objects. The rest of us, the rest of the time, frequently engage in rituals of destruction and concealing, everything from cleaning out our closets to toppling statues of former leaders or others who represent systems of values that have become untenable. In order to have a coherent ethical system for the treatment of cultural heritage, we must be able to deal with one of the key rights of ownership, the right to destroy. If we think that cultural property must be preserved at all costs, does that mean we can never take down statues honoring Lenin or Hitler or racists or colonialists or doctors who experimented on unanesthetized slave women? Merriman's second provost value, that of truth, also runs into problems by prioritizing Western experiences of cultural property. He's concerned with authenticity, by which he means that the cultural property should genuinely evoke the pathos of a people whose works have largely vanished from the earth. Merriman assumes, as did many museums of the 19th and early 20th centuries, that indigenous and local cultures are fated to die in the face of Western conquest, colonialism, and influence, and that the goal of heritage preservation is to scoop up as many of their artifacts as possible before these cultures fade away entirely. Fortunately, today we see that cultures can endure under incredible stress, and many groups have been successfully fighting to preserve their languages, religions, ways of life, and culture in general. But even if we correct Merriman's assumptions about doomed cultures, there remains the problem of the way in which he thinks about truth as a value. The basic concern is for authenticity, he explains, which is fundamental to most of the reasons why we care about cultural property. Is this a genuine relic speaking truly of its time? The difficulty here is that many of us use cultural artifacts in ways that have very little to do with the way in which they speak about their place and time of origin, and much to do with our own wants and needs in the moment we're looking at them. Only a small subset of people, academic specialists, are concerned with rigorously considered truth values of artifacts, what they reveal about a certain time in the past, and that only really for certain artifacts at certain times. I, for example, might spend hours looking at ancient Greek spindles to try and understand Greek weaving technologies, but then I will wander to another part of the museum and simply enjoy some of the artifacts from, say, medieval Korea, seeing them simply as objects and without knowledge of their originating culture, and without, frankly, even reading the signs or desiring to know more of this truth, because my own areas of specialty are quite enough truth for me. I need some mystery, some space for my imagination. However, imaginative use of cultural artifacts is not as simple a value as it might seem. One answer to the question of who should control heritage is that we should all be able to use heritage in whatever way we want, as long as our use does not preclude the use of others. But this principle does not accommodate destruction, modification, or censorship of images. And even something as seemingly simple as digital reproduction can run into many problems when we consider its relation to authenticity and truth. IS's destruction at Palmyra has been met, for example, with a flurry of projects with the goal of combating the destruction through the use of digital technologies, which allow for the creation of 3D digital models. These models can exist more or less in isolation as files which allow viewers to examine an object or site virtually, or can be embedded within elaborate presentations that include supplemental information in the form of text, audio, reconstruction of vanished elements such as pigmentation, etc. The models can even be combined with 3D printing technology to allow the creation of physical recreations, from scale models to life-size replicas printed in concrete. For example, an organization called the Institute for Digital Archaeology has created a 3D model of an ancient Roman triumphal arch destroyed by IS in Palmyra, working from photographs taken by scholars and tourists before the destruction. A scale replica, 20 feet tall instead of the original 50, has been carved in marble by robots working from the digital model, and the arch has already been displayed in Trafalgar Square, London, and City Hall Park, New York, with plans to travel elsewhere. 3D modeling and printing such as this has been hailed in the press as a savior and a remedy to IS's destruction. It is claimed we can use these technologies to preserve threatened sites, reconstruct destroyed ones, and disseminate knowledge of the past cheaply and easily all over the globe. But few thinkers have examined in any depth the messages communicated by these models. Even the most simple or naive-seeming model, after all, is created within a web of beliefs and about its subject matter and about the world as a whole. I am particularly interested in looking at control and absence within these digital reconstructions of threatened or destroyed Middle Eastern cultural heritage. So far, most of the founders and prime movers of these digital projects that focus on archaeological sites in Syria or Iraq are from America or Western Europe, and they have not uniformly sought the input on the creation, control, and interpretation of images from Syrians or Iraqis. This lack of control over the reconstructions is mirrored by a general absence within the reconstructions of indications that these sites had lived post-antique histories. These reconstructions thus raise questions not just about who owns antiquity, but about who controls its perception. Who owns Palmyra's intellectual property? Whose interpretations do we value? I am also concerned about absences of human figures, alternate interpretations, time, and certain sites. Only very rarely do digital models of cultural heritage contain human figures, such as the inhabitants of the site at the time evoked by the reconstruction, or those who lived there before its destruction. And most reconstructions force the viewers into predetermined paths through the landscape. Even those projects that offer more user-directed alternatives in which the viewer can choose areas of focus still limit the viewer's choices. The expense of building a virtual world, of course, means that the user's experience is heavily determined by the designer's vision of this world. It is more that the user can choose to ignore some content, but cannot easily envision an alternate interpretation. Most of the current digital reconstructions have another type of absence, that of time. While it is possible to allow the viewer to access different images of the same site or monument at different moments in its history, most current digital projects display at most the artifact as it exists now and the artifact as the creator of the digital module envisions that it existed when it was first created. This selective choice of time, again in part a product of the expense of creating more views of the object, leaves out information about the way the object has passed through time and the meanings it accreted onto it during its journey. And finally, we can look at the absence of certain sites or types of sites in the current race to digitalize cultural monuments in Syria and Iraq. These projects overwhelmingly focus on pre-Islamic heritage, sites like Palmyra or Nimrud that were created by Romans or the empires of the ancient Near East. In reality, only a small percentage of the cultural sites destroyed by IS are this ancient. Most of the sites they target are shrines, mosques, churches, cemeteries, and other sacred sites important to Christian, Yazidi, and branches of Islam that IS finds heretical. What effects do these absences of human figures, alternate interpretations, time, and certain sites have? These absences mean that even seemingly simple digital models transmit convincing, unified interpretations of objects, leaving no room for alternative interpretations or even signaling that alternative interpretations might exist. The empty spaces of digital reconstructions can appear ready for conquest, in the same way that early European settlers imagined the landscape of America to be empty. Paintings, drawings, and other photographs, and later photographs, showed vast stretches of land without any inhabitants. These works aimed attention away from Native Americans and their settlements and redirected viewers' perceptions to help elide the fact of these other claims to the wide open land. Similarly, the emptiness of digital reconstructions leave the viewer free to claim these spaces for their own interpretations and identification. And the creators of digital reconstructions can project their own visions of cultural heritage because there is an imbalance in the legal system. The creators have copyright protection for their visions of the past, while those who possess physical cultural heritage do not. In this context, while looking at non-digital reconstruction projects, we can see what might at first appear to be weaknesses. Technological crudity, obviousness of artifice, lack of mimetic illusion are actually strengths that permit or even force the viewer to arrive at their own interpretations of the modeled heritage. For example, a number of Syrian artifacts living in a refugee camp Syrian artists living in a refugee camp in Jordan are recreating damaged, destroyed, or simply unreachable to them cultural sites using the few materials available to them: wood, clay, rocks. Unsurprisingly, the project intended to commemorate cultural heritage includes not only ancient sites, but also more recent monuments important to living faiths. One of the most careful of their scale models is that of a mosque at Damascus, considered to be one of the holiest sites of Islam and heavily damaged during the current conflict. Both the artists are ecumenical. An art teacher and painter named Mohammed Hariri has built a model of Palmyra from clay and wooden kebab skewers, explaining that his goal is for the refugee camp residents to be connected with their country and culture. This is the way for them not to forget, he says. Palmyra's destroyed temples should themselves remind us of this disconnect between interpretation and appearance. Both temples were used as Christian churches during the Byzantine era and then as mosques after the coming of Islam. These transformations were mainly in the worshippers' imaginations. There was little modification to the architecture and even less to the images within it. The hard-eyed paternal face of Bel or Baal Shamin simply became that of another god, with the same supreme power, the same distant fatherliness, without the need for physical changes. When considering who owns the intellectual property of the past, we need to remind ourselves of what is a long tradition of Westerners assuming that they are the only ones who care about antiquity. For example, there's Charles Montague Dodi, who wrote a book, Travels in Arabia Deserta, about his years from 1876 to 1878, walking through the Arabian Peninsula in search of pre-Arabic inscriptions. Dodi hated the heat, the dust, the tainted water the Bedouin he traveled with shared from their wells. He thought their women were ugly, their children diseased, and their food disgusting. He wrote that no one believed him when he said he was looking for inscriptions. He thought he was constantly spied on and harassed in the belief that he was in search of buried treasure. Why else would someone come so far and suffer so much? And I hardly believe him myself. He was recording inscriptions written in Dabbatian, a language that neither he nor anyone else would be able to decipher for years to come. The lettering was so alien that even after carefully questioning the Bedouin about the writings they claimed to have seen in distant caves or isolated rocks, they frequently led Dodi not towards carved inscription, but towards stones scratched by animals or sculpted by sandstorms. Dodi proclaimed to everyone who asked, and he said that everyone did ask, that he was a Christian. He describes guns drawn, blows struck, murder threatened and averted, he claims, only through the reluctant actions of his guide, but no one actually harmed him. They gave him camel's milk and let him sleep in the shade of their tents. And yet he rejected all companionship offered by the people whose lands he wandered, writing that the sun made me an Arab, but never warped me to Orientalism. For far too long, I looked at Palmyra over Dodi's shoulder. I too assumed that the modern populations of areas of archaeological interest would not care about the ancient past, would be ignorant of its wonders, might harm me, or at best distract me from my researches. And then came the news from Palmyra, not about the temples, but about what IS did first. First, they released images of their beheading of Palmyra's retired chief of antiquities. He was 81. His name was Khalid al-Assad, but he had studied and excavated and managed the ruins so long he was known as Mr. Palmyra. They brought him to the square in a black van, then used loudspeakers to call for people to come and watch the execution, one witness reported. They left his body on the ground in the square in front of his museum for hours, and when the heat of the day had passed, they moved it closer to his ruins. They tied red twine around his wrists and strung up his body from a traffic light. They put his glasses back on and set his head on the ground between his dangling legs. Al-Assad hung where his ancestors had lived for centuries. In 1691, when Halifax described Palmyra's population, he called it a poor, miserable, dirty people living in little huts made of dirt within the enclosure walls of the sanctuary of Bel, saying that never before had he seen such a mixture of the greatest state and magnificence together with the extremity of filth and poverty. The villagers, a handful of families, continued to live in the shadow of the Temple of Bel until 1929, when a French archaeological expedition cleared the ruins of Palmyra and moved their inhabitants to a new adjoining town of Tadmor. Al-Assad was born there in 1934, just 5 years later. IS was not the first invading force to sweep over his home and the ruins about which he dreamed. Tadmor held an oil pipeline as well as an airfield used by German planes to bomb British operations in the Middle East. In 1941, a British infantry column invaded Tadmor while overhead the Royal Air Force shot down 6 Vichy French Air Force bombers. The British lieutenant who led a patrol in the ancient city when night fell wrote of how incredible, if somewhat eerie, the ruins looked in the moonlight. We do not know what the young Al-Assad thought of these warplanes circling above him and these armed men sliding through the shadows of Palmyra's columns. They left eventually. Perhaps he thought if he waited long enough, IS would do the same. Perhaps he thought that he was safe in his fortress of ancient images. When they hung his body, they tied a placard around his waist listing his crimes in red ink. One of these crimes was traveling to infidel conferences while serving as Palmyra's director of idolatry. I think of him at these conferences, leaning forward over a podium, his glasses slipping down his nose as he taps on his text to emphasize his point, talking about the deities of Palmyra, never thinking that a loyalty to the gods of the long dead would be enough of a threat to kill him. When Al-Assad died, I finally understood that Dodi and his kin were wrong. The dry isolation of the ivory tower holds no special right over the past. Both those born far from Palmyra and those who live in its shadow can interpret the past. Which brings us to Merriman's third and last proposed core value, which I promise I will cover only briefly, the value of access, by which he means we should ensure that the widest possible public should see cultural heritage objects. The idea of access, what it means, who should have it, has changed radically in our lifetimes. But for Merriman, the value of access is limited to a certain type of access, the ability to engage in museum-based looking from a distance. This despite the fact that the way museums use cultural heritage objects can be very different from the ways in which these artifacts are used in their source communities. Museum use is about looking, not touching. Museum use is about display, not hiding or burial or destruction. Museum use is concerned with objective facts about the past, not about subjective personal reaction to artifacts. Museum use is about the worship of beauty, but not literally. Artworks within them are no longer gods, even though many source cultures regard the objects they create or that their ancestors created as either being divine or having some sort of special connection with the numinous. Merriman fails to take into account that people want access to cultural objects to perform different types of actions. The way that cultural heritage objects function within a museum is a very definite, circumscribed, limited type of use. Our decisions about how heritage should operate in the world should not be shaped entirely by this one type of use, this one type of owner. The ways in which we value and promote access also needs to be reconceived for the digital era, especially when it comes to digital models of artifacts destroyed by IS, since this destruction has been paired with the refugee crisis. For those forced to flee their homes, the cultural sites that form part of their personal and national identities become yet more precious, and their destruction more painful, and yet disconnected, dispossessed refugees have little power to contribute to digital reconstruction projects or attempt to shape their interpretations. Digitization is generally regarded as a solution to problems of access, since, for example, someone without the funds to travel to an archive can now access its digital information. But the playing field is not yet entirely level. Not everyone has the connectivity devices or language skills required to either access or contribute to digital reconstructions. I'm not able to offer a replacement set of universal values for Merriman's to make decisions about cultural property neat and easy. I'm only able to point out that Merriman's triad of values are valid for a very specific we, and valid only if this we controls all decision making. His supposedly universal values are defined on the basis of unstated, biased assumptions, and following them privileges a few owners and users at the expense of others. I am instead taking the position that there can be no universal values because cultural artifacts are not experienced universally. They are experienced by each of us, each with our own lives and felt identities. So in the end, we must return to Merriman's starting point. He begins this article with the observation that the resolution of disputes about cultural property is complicated with the difference in the attitudes and agenda of the people involved in these decisions. If there are no universal values with which we can move beyond or neutralize these differences in points of view, we must work within these differences to answer questions, including the question of who owns cultural property. We must listen to many voices, both those who are already speaking and those who have not yet found a place in Western-dominated scholarship. We must stop believing that we can find solutions that will satisfy everyone, and instead embrace solutions that leave everyone at least a little angry. After all, interpretations and the roles they play in people's lives are the true value offered by cultural heritage. Heritage sites have little inherent values. They offer empty, uninhabitable buildings, graves, heaps of battered stones. They have value only in relation to how we see them. The past lives only in our imaginations. We must be all the more careful then to treat those sites in a manner that does not destroy this value. We must all work to keep open the many lines of sight on the past. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. Thank you very much, that was wonderful. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask? Yes.
When you were talking about the digital preserving of places, specifically with Palmyra, if I understood correctly, one of your critiques on that is that it is digitizing a static point. You talked about no people being in there, and I'm thinking that when I visit ancient sites, I did not have the joy of seeing Palmyra, but I have seen other places. When I go there, I am in a static point of time when I see it, and I can only imagine really what I'm seeing there. You know, I can't if I'm in a ancient temple that has been converted to a church. You know, the Duomo of Syracuse, for example. All I'm seeing is the Duomo as a church. When I'm in, I can visualize, you know, through what I see, but I can't see it over time. So my question is, why is that a critique? I mean, obviously there's no people in it. I would see people, you know, when I visit sites. Why is that a critique for you of the digitizing, that it's a static moment? Because it's a static moment when I see it in real life.
I'm told I should restate the questions for the purposes of the video. Unfortunately, you eloquently restated your question in the last sentence. So why is it a critique of digital reconstructions that they are static, have only one moment in time, when if you visit a site in real life, you're only in that moment of time that you're in? And I think I would disagree with you, because when you visit an archaeological site, your guidebook is telling you one thing, your tour guide is telling you one thing, you overhear other tour guides telling you other things, you have other people asking questions from like, what's that, mommy, to in my dissertation, I describe this feature as blah, blah, blah. You see the monument represented in cheesy engravings in your hotel room or in the train station. You see it used on stamps, on governmental objects. You see and have many more questions of conflicting interpretations. Even if those differences are small and subtle, I think visiting a site is a different experience than you're clicking on the computer screen. It seems so convincing that this is what experts have decided that this site may be. So maybe this is in part a way that I visit sites more than other people do, but I think digitization cuts out even more of those possibilities of wondering what this site means to other people than it does when you're there and wondering why in the world did so many other people take this airplane flight or whatever to get here.
Based on Merriman's 3 points, preservation, truth, and access, what should we do with the Confederate generals? And we don't have to talk about the Middle East, talk about it here. what do we do with those? Do we leave them there? Do we take them down? Can they be kept on private property? Should we digitalize them and hope people can understand?
So what should we do with Confederate monuments? And I think this is a very hard question, but also one that we have to ask. And I brought it into this talk because when ISIS was destroying things in 2015, everyone was saying, we can't destroy any piece of history. And now that there's been a protest about Confederate pieces, I think the public opinion has shifted to we must destroy anything that we don't like. So how do you have that point of view where how can we say we can destroy Confederate monuments without condemning ISIS for destroying what they said was something that was also part of a system that they hated? I think you can do it in certain ways. For example, the IS videos in which they proclaim their destruction are all about we're destroying because this is against Islam, but then in reality they only destroyed a few things and sold the rest to make money, so their attitude toward destruction is different. There have been many proposals for Confederate monuments, from leave them up to take them down but put them in museums. I haven't heard anybody digitizing them, although that would be interesting. I think we should really look for models to former sort of Soviet satellite states who have done a number of interesting things with the many, many, many statues of Lenin and Stalin and et cetera. In Ukraine, a statue of Lenin had a big wireless tower installed in the head, so now it's providing wireless access to the town. Or in Ukraine, a number of artists keep painting communist statues to make them look like superheroes, to sort of make fun of, question, but also leave up. So there are lots of intermediate steps between just taking down and preserving at all costs. But I certainly do not have all the answers on that one either, but I think that's something you should keep asking the speakers who appear in this series.
A question about an image you showed of the reconstructed Palmyra Arch that looked like it was part of a wedding. I was wondering what's going on in that image and kind of what context that arch is abstracted from, and what it's being used for.
Yeah, so this was the unveiling of the arch in City Hall Park in New York. It was kind of a rainy day, so the people you see in this photograph are basically the only people who attended. It was a little bit of a sad event, and these are supposedly musicians playing Syrian music. But yeah, it does kind of look like a wedding. But in both Trafalgar Square and in City Hall Park, New York, it was presented with no context whatsoever, really no signage even. So if you didn't know what it was, you'd think, why is there an arch sitting here? And also, as you can kind of see, this is part of a larger architectural complex, not just this arch shaved off. And also, I guess it's a little hard to see, but if you all know your column capital types, these are Corinthian capitals that have been sort of reduced to these little like licks of stone because the digital sculptor who reconstructed this kind of gave up at certain complex points. There's also blank spaces where confusing detail was taken off. So this project was described as being super, super complete and accurate. And they were talking about things like we had to decide whether or not to include the spider webs or not that were on it, but actually there's been simplification. So to me, this is another example of how when you see this object and you're not a Palmyran archaeologist, you might assume that this is an accurate representation of the past, and it's really not in a number of ways.
So I have a question about destruction of cultural heritage, since archaeology is a form of destruction. I feel it's very interesting you're showing the position of Stalin statue as reference for cultural destruction of cultural heritage. Does this heritage of certain form of culture have to be carried on through the preservation of certain artifacts? Because you can obviously tear down Stalin and change the policy of the nation, but can you really erase the human needs of popular revolution when the right time comes? Same thing goes for Nazi Germany. So you can ban the Nazi salute and the public worship of Hitler, but can you also eliminate really the fascism and extreme conservatism among people's mind? So, so my point is that there's something that really you cannot eliminate just through this destruction of artifacts, because part of the cultural heritage is already within your ethnic identity, something that cannot be erased.
So a very eloquent set of ideas about the relation, asking about the relation between preservation and destruction, and the relation between artifacts and truth and life. So destroying a monument doesn't mean you're destroying the history of National Socialism, or et cetera. And I think you're absolutely right, and that we tend to think of heritage and preservation as opposed, but really they go hand in hand, because heritage or preservation and destruction are both about what version of the past we value. So what alternate versions are we destroying in the hopes of eradicating that history or not repeating that history, and what versions are we preserving, or what versions are we creating through a sort of reconstruction along lines where we're emphasizing some things and de-emphasizing others. And this is always true. So Palmyra is one of the best preserved cities of antiquity precisely because of destruction, because in the 3rd century, its queen Zenobia revolted against the Roman Empire and was crushed by the Emperor Aurelian, who took away the trade routes. So the city's wealth dried up very quickly. Its inhabitants went elsewhere, and it was a city abandoned, a city that died in terms of its population, its own history, but in doing so that preserved the city in this sort of time warp for us to appreciate later.
This probably also has like 1,000 different answers to it, but I was wondering, in legally, is it like, what is the definition of a piece of cultural heritage? What constitutes culture?
So legally, what is the definition of cultural heritage? There's a very exact definition, which you will laugh at, because in all the international conventions, it's something that's more than 100 years old. So that's a very, very broad range of objects, which is totally ignored in practice. A lot of countries, Italy, Turkey, et cetera, technically their laws are you can't take anything out of the country that's more than 100 years old without permission, and obviously that doesn't happen for something from 1856. And the idea that you could cover dinosaurs' bones in the same category as 19th century photographs is totally ridiculous. So what happens in practice is that these very, very broad laws get narrowed down to specific types of objects when we're actually enforcing them. So for example, the United States is a signatory to this UNESCO convention, but it ignores any traffic in cultural heritage illegally exported from its country of origin unless the country of origin has an agreement with the US. So if you show up with an ancient Roman object that you took from Libya, you could show it off at customs, like, look, I have this Hercules or something, and they'd say, great, because we don't care what Libya says about what you can't take out of the country. If you do the same thing with Italy, you'd be in trouble because Italy and the US have a longstanding agreement. But it's very problematic because this agreement is, Corinthian capitals, mosaics, figurines from Rome, but not medieval stuff. So sort of the laws depend on customs officials to become art history experts in a way that doesn't often happen. And it's very easy to sort of fool these. So for example, in a certain period, ancient pre-Columbian ceramics were being smuggled into the US from Mexico by smugglers who would just put some fresh clay on the bottom and stamped, made in Mexico on the bottom to make it look like a tourist tchotchke. And then, who could tell the difference at the border?
What do you think about the potential for VR and like clarifying what artifacts might look like in different kind of like form of Palmyra?
All right, so what's the potential for VR and clarifying what different sites might have looked like. And I gotta call out your shirt. You've got a Hamilton quote on your shirt, which is a nice example of how like very different interpretations of the past can be very powerful in the present in a way that's not true to the past, but is powerful for us today. So I think, you know, I kind of come out as being very grumpy and down on virtual and digital technologies, but it's because I think they have such great promise. And including here, some UNH scholars are doing great things with digital reconstructions at Pompeii. And I just want to see more of these higher standards evolved by people who are thinking about what do we need to do rather than just, ooh, I can click a few buttons and laser scan this and then we're done. You know, no need to have responsibilities to anybody else, which is all too easy to do online.
So we take students to Rome every year, and we always end at Pompeii, where we take students to a very particular room where there's a beautiful wall painting, and around this beautiful wall painting there are literally hundreds of modern graffiti scratches, names, Bob was here, etc. And Professor Brunet may remember when we took students to the Colosseum, an Italian jumped over a rope to take a picture with a statue of Trajan, the Emperor Trajan, and put his hand on the sword, which could have broken off quite easily if he had been too aggressive. And so we always ask these students, you know, should everyone be able to go to these ancient sites? And we have a freewheeling discussion, and some students say, well, people should have to take a test before they can go in and actually see these things. And other people say, well, no, it has to be, you know, accessible to everyone because we're trying to promote the interest in this object. I wonder if you could talk about access in terms of preservation from maybe people who just don't quite know about what this means or they don't have a clear idea what it means.
So should everybody be allowed to access ancient sites, even the yahoos who take selfies and break things or carve graffiti? There's actually many cases of selfie breakage. I have a whole file folder on my computer of people doing terrible things. Mentioning Pompeii also made me think of how the interest in preserving one moment of time continues. So actually Pompeii was heavily bombed during World War II, but it was all reconstructed to look back as it had when it was first excavated. So there's this project of maintaining this untouched past when it's obvious when you visit it that it's been manhandled all over the place by inscribers or other people. It's very tempting to set limitations on who gets to access or own the past. And I think we should fight against that because so often we have assumed that various categories of people won't care about the past wrongly, totally wrongly. We have assumed it's okay to take objects from countries because they don't really care about it. Liberia, for example, just got funds from UNESCO to renovate their museum. Now they have this beautiful museum in Liberia and nothing to fill it with because its cultural heritage has been taken over the last couple of decades to various other countries. So I think impulses to control access should always be deeply examined to see what motives underlie them. And we also need to spend money on what is the essentially unsexy area of security. And if we can keep in the Metropolitan Museum people from kissing the paintings, which is something that many people want to do, we can keep the same at Pompeii. So you can't underfund a site and expect people to behave by following rules that only certain sets of people know.
It's a great talk, and it's full of all sorts of wonderful questions about where we go here. So my question, it's a little devil made me do it kind of question, but what do you think of adaptive reuse? Because I'm not a big fan of coalition forces. You have this slide of coalition forces adapting an ancient site for contemporary use. And in the much shorter realm of sort of American preservationist archaeology, there's a lot of discussion all the time about taking 18th and 19th century buildings that have lost their use, and they're all decaying and becoming rat holes and vision nests, and doing something with them. And that often seems to anchor sort of heritage tourism or different discussions about that. So, throwing this back into your lap, what do you think about adaptive reuse?
All right, so what do I think about adaptive reuse, this phenomena of reusing heritage buildings in a way that changes their appearance, their use, etc. I think I'm more open to it than a lot of archaeologists. I tend to I also think some antiquities should sometimes be sold, which don't tell any archaeologists. Oops, I just did. But I think we have to have these compromises because our positions have been so polarized. Don't touch it versus, let's knock it down and put in a farm instead. That compromises can be more valuable than they have been thought to be. And after all, most buildings that survive from antiquity survive because they were used as other things, as churches and mosques and etc.
This is sort of a legal question. I'm not sure how to state this, but with all the questions about VR and 3D imaging, there seems to be no organization that's looking at this, that's monitoring it. And I'm wondering if there's been any cases where people have seen either VR or 3D imaging and have tried to say, we haven't given you permission to do it like this. It seems like those sorts of cases will be coming up as the technology moves so quickly.
Have there been any cases where people have protested digitization or any effort to try and monitor it? Well, sometimes I feel like my grumpiness is one of the few voices. But no, people are thinking about it. There haven't been a whole lot of organizational efforts to try and monitor this. The place where people are scrutinizing this the most are in the digitization of various indigenous cultures artifacts. Particularly, the Smithsonian has been working with some Inuit tribes to produce 3D models of various fragile, culturally important artifacts that may or may not be something that the cultural origin wants to be sort of shared widely. And there have been interesting compromises reached. So some ceremonial objects which have been digitized, you can see the 3D models online, but you can't download the files because they don't want people to modify those files and put them to their own uses. Where the original artifact itself has been repatriated to the tribe, no one can touch it but the designated guardians in the tribe, but it's okay for the museum to display the digitized artifact. I think people assume that, if we let people dispute this, there'll be just a no, don't do anything. But in practice, there have been a lot of compromises reached. Although there's been a lot of overreaching as well. For example, there's been a widespread and very successful movement to repatriate human remains from museums to their tribes of origin or their cultures of origin. But we've found out in some cases that the museums have retained DNA samples from the bodies they've repatriated without permission from the ancestors. So there's levels and levels of all of this that need to be considered.
I wonder if what you could say about the relationship between all of the issues you've talked about in relation to ownership and the question of crime. Presumably crime, a definition of a crime implies some concept of ownership, which has been violated in some way. But laws are formulated against crime in a different way from the way, philosophers and academics and so on would talk about concepts of ownership. So how do those two things relate to one another?
So what are the relationship between questions of ownership and questions of crime, because crime is formulated as a crime against someone? And this is, I think, very interesting because who the owner that is offended against by the various crimes committed against cultural heritage varies, and who you designated as the owner is very important. So do you designate the particular state who under international law owns that heritage, or do you designate the world with the idea of universal cultural heritage that belongs to us all, so an offense of destroying that heritage offends us all? And this can have very specific legal consequences. So for example, as we all know, Syria has been undergoing a period of civil war, of conflict. Many antiquities have been looted during this conflict and smuggled out of the country. Many of these have been seized by various countries to which they have penetrated around the world. Only one country has given back any antiquities to Syria so far. And the other countries are all holding them for further investigation, despite the fact that the UNESCO Convention doesn't really allow this delay in repatriation. You're supposed to just give it back to the people it belongs to under international regime. The question of why countries are not willing to give it back to Syria is fairly easily answered when you consider that they don't really want to give things back to the Assad regime, known for human rights abuses and also, among other things, for itself selling antiquities against the laws of Syria. But there is within the law this concept of the state as owner, the state as defined by who is currently ruling it. But underneath it lies a stronger concept, which is applying now of, well, maybe we all own cultural heritage, and therefore our broader interests are greater served by keeping this in the UK, in the US, instead of giving back to Syria now. And I think the slippage between which owner you designate, depending on what you want to do with the crime, is something that needs to become much more transparent in international law negotiations, because now it's allowing for a lot of assumptions about who should own things according to the particular governmental official who's making the decisions to slip in and control in a way not envisioned by these international instruments. For a very lawyerly answer.
So, kind of follow up on that a little bit. You mentioned earlier that one of the things that goes along with ownership, or the concept of ownership, is who's able to destroy something. So if something is owned by the world or by everyone, does that also kind of imply that anyone has the right to destroy something?
Oh, so if we all own cultural heritage, can we all destroy it? I think that logically, yes, that follows. So it shows that the way we define ownership is not clear if that consequence is not one that we're willing to accept. So for example, in the US, we've all been up in arms about IS destruction, as we should be, of course, but under our law, you can do whatever you want with any artwork created before the passage of the Visual Artist Rights Law, which restricts a very small category of what you can do. But if I bought the Constitution, I could rip it up. If I bought a Jackson Pollock, I could make it into a dress and wear it to a party. Our law, one of the rights of ownership is the right to destroy. Now I want a Jackson Pollock dress. That'd be nice.
Thank you very much. Oh, there's one more question.
So something that you mentioned was the negative aspect of how to recreate certain artifacts. What's your opinion on, like, do you think it's better to just leave destroyed sites such as Palmyra and, Pompeii as is, whether it's destroyed by humans or just by natural decay?
All right, do I think it's better just to leave destroyed sites as is? And another heretical answer, kind of. Because I am an archaeologist, so to me, once something has come out of the ground, it's dead. Once something has been looted, there's no more information that can be obtained from it because we're dependent on archaeological excavations to tell us the information we should have known about this thing. So to me, nothing drives me crazier than to hear people debate the Elgin marbles as the be-all and end-all of cultural heritage, because there's nothing more we can learn from them, whereas every day people are digging holes, are destroying archaeological sites that could otherwise yield huge amounts of information about the past, about our world, about ourselves. So I think our funds, our time should be going into preventing looting rather than worrying about the things that have been out of the ground for, in some cases, hundreds of years.
So I totally concur about your objection to looting, but unfortunately it happened. So it seems to me that while you're an archaeologist, and really have a vested interest in things remain undisturbed so you can get maximum value from them, isn't there an argument to be made about just the wonders of human imagination working on items that are really decontextualized because they've been taken from Libya or Syria or whatever and put in New York or London or you name it. And yet, when people go and they look at these things and they imagine it, something happens, and I would suggest sometimes people don't imagine what happens. So if you talk about access, small d democratic access, it seems to me that the multitudes might have access to those things in wondrous ways where the subset of archaeologists is quite minute.
So, should we reconceptualize access to include the access that people have to decontextualize looted objects, or maybe decontextualize for other reasons, because there is something magical that happens? I totally agree. Nice place to plug my book, Possession, which is about private collectors and exactly what they are doing when they're looking at decontextualized objects. And through history, people have used these in amazing myriad ways. I think my short answer would be, but we already have enough of those. There are decontextualized objects in every mantelpiece on Fifth Avenue and in museums across the globe. Let's just leave some in the ground for us to look at later. Thank you again for having me.